The art that people make is, at its core, a reflection of the times in which its creator lived. A poem from Marwan Markool reads, "In order for me to write poetry that isn't political, I must listen to the birds, and in order to hear the birds, the warplanes must be silent." It should be of no surprise that the cinema of Palestine has been built around resistance and community building, and that as the conditions within Palestine have changed, so have the movies produced in it. Despite the decades of occupation endured by the Palestinian people, they have continued to put out numerous acclaimed documentary and narrative films alike, documenting resistance and memorializing their existence. But this is not how Palestinian cinema has always been. The cinema of Palestine has been broken up into 4 different time periods. The first time period, known as the early years, ran from the late 1800s up until 1948. Auguste and Louis Lumière were 2 French brothers who, in 1895, had invented the cinématographe, a device which would record moving pictures. To use their new invention, they had sent out Jean-Alexandre Promiot to various cities around the world to record new footage. One of the cities that he would end up visiting is Jerusalem. Here he would record the shorts Palestine 1896 and Leaving Jerusalem by Railway, some of the very first travel videos ever created. Contrary to the stories we are told of Palestine being a barren land with no people or culture, we can see busy and diverse crowds of people walking through markets and visiting holy sites. Promiot made sure to record religious Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people performing religious rituals side by side, and as Promiot gets on a train to leave, people gather to watch him go. As cameras and film equipment would slowly become more available, the first Palestinians would begin producing their own films. Ibrahim Hassan Sirhan, born and raised in Jaffa, would begin recording documentaries at just 20 years old, with his first ever recording being that of a visit of Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia. He would continue recording documentaries about visiting politicians and one about orphans before founding Palestinian Studio, the first Palestinian film group. Under this label, he directed the first Palestinian narrative film in 1945, titled Holiday Eve. Unfortunately, no record of Holiday Eve or any of Sirhan's early documentary work remains, because in 1948 during the Nakba, Sirhan would flee his hometown and go to Jordan, and any traces of his work during this time were destroyed. Between 1948 and 1967, the second period of Palestinian cinema, known as the Epoch of Silence, took place. Now that the majority of Palestinians had found themselves either as oppressed minorities within their own country or foreigners in other countries, the infant Palestinian film industry had been destroyed. Other Palestinian artists, such as Ghassan Kanafani, continued to write poems, stories, and articles about Palestine, but film, a medium that requires so much planning, financial support, and people with the training and experience to work on set, took longer to start up again. The Epoch of Silence is named so because of the very few films produced during this time focusing on Palestine. Ibrahim Hassan Sirhan found work in the Jordanian film industry, collaborating with Wasef Sheikh Yassin to make the 1957 film The Struggle in Jaresh, an adventure movie that was unrelated to Palestine, but the very first movie that Jordan would ever produce. The second film of note during this epoch was another Jordanian film, entitled My Homeland, My Love, released in 1964 and directed by a Palestinian living in the diaspora, Abdallah Kabash. Although the film was remastered in Cairo in the 2000s, I've been unable to find the movie itself, though descriptions of the movie read that it is a documentary that focuses on Palestinian music, from more traditional folk songs to newer protest music, and even early examples of Arabic rap. It was around this time that Israel attacked Egypt and began to take over more Palestinian land in what would become the Six-Day War. Palestinians had started forming resistance groups like the PLO and the PFLP and started to fight back against their occupiers, literally, and also in terms of filmmaking, with movies in this next period funded and supported by Palestinian resistance groups, focusing on documenting resistance and the tragedies suffered by the Palestinian people. This next period, known as the Revolutionary Period, ran from 1968 to 1982. Palestinian artists such as Mustafa Abu Ali, Hani Jawariya, and Sulafa Jadala, who some people consider to be the very first Arab camera woman, banded together and formed the Palestine Film Unit, which was supported by groups like the PLO and the PFLP. These filmmakers were inspired by newsreels and other films made by groups in similar circumstances, like the Vietnamese, for example. The first of these films would be 1973's Scenes from the Occupation in Gaza, one of the first videos ever produced of life in the Gaza Strip over 50 years ago. From the narration talking about life under occupation, acts of resistance against colonialism, and the reactions of families finding out their homes have been destroyed, this film shows how little things have changed since the 70s in the Gaza Strip.
يقول أحد ضباط العدو إنني أفضل الاشتراك في 5 حروب على أن أشترك مرة واحدة في مواجهة المخربين في غزة.
Other documentaries would similarly document the Palestinian struggle in other parts of Palestine, with the film They Do Not Exist showing the living conditions of refugee camps in Lebanon under constant Israeli bombardment, and the film Tal el-Zatar, including footage of the Tal el-Zatar refugee camp massacre, as well as interviews with those who survived it. One film from this period that would hint towards the future development of Palestinian cinema is the 1976 documentary Palestine in the Eye, which turns the camera inward on the Palestinian Film Unit itself. Hani Jawariya, one of the founding members of the Palestine Film Unit, was killed in Beirut by an Israeli missile, and feeling the effect of this loss on the group, members began to interview each other and members of their community to come to a better understanding of what his legacy has meant to Palestinian cinema as a whole.
هاي الكاميرا اللي كانت معه
مبين عليها معطل نهائيا، أكيد بيكون الفيلم اللي فيها احترق.
ما هو الله يرحمه استشهد هو واستشهدت الكاميرا معه. القذيفة اجت بالضبط على بعد نص متر منه. اللقطات اللي شايفينها هلا على الشاشة هي آخر لقطات صورها.
Other noticeable contributions to this period of film are films made by non-Palestinian supporters of the Palestinian cause, such as the 1970 film Al Fatah Palestina, directed by the Italian Luigi Pirelli, a documentary which tries to educate Western audiences about Fatah and Yasser Arafat. Similar to that film is the 1971 documentary PFLP, Declaration of World War, directed by a Japanese supporter of the PFLP, Masao Adachi. Adachi had been a member of the Japanese Red Army, a Marxist-Leninist group that wanted to overthrow the Japanese government. Through this group, he came into close contact with members of the PFLP and ended up living in Lebanon for 20 years, training with members of Palestinian resistance groups and collecting years' worth of footage of PFLP members training, talking about their beliefs, and waiting for combat. This footage, along with his narration and reflections on what revolution means, came together to make this up-close and personal documentary of people that most Western countries would have simply branded as mindless terrorists.
日本の同志たち、日本の革命的同志たちへメッセージを送りたいと思います。最初に言わなければならないのは、我々が全世界の革命家を結合し、統一しなければならないということです。なぜなら、我々の闘争は単一のものであり、決して分断されてはならないものだからです。そして、世界の帝国主義勢力は今や統合されたものとして出現しているからです。
Although the majority of Palestinian films up until this point had been documentaries, a select few narrative films were also starting to be made. The Dupes, released in 1972 by director Tawfiq Saleh, follows 3 generations of Palestinian men who live in the refugee camps in Iraq, seeking to find transportation to Kuwait. The 3 men, each of them traveling for different reasons, education, marriage, and work, find refuge in the water tank of a truck driver who's agreed to smuggle them across the border. The Dupes was based on the novel by Ghassan Kanafani, Men in the Sun, although the film changes an important part of the novel's original ending. Another movie from this period that was based on the works of Ghassan Kanafani was Qassem Havel's 1982 film Return to Haifa, which follows the story of 2 Palestinians who are granted permission to visit their old city and search for the child they lost during the Nakba. As they walk through what used to be their homeland, they find their old house, now inhabited by a couple of Holocaust survivors who've adopted their son, gave him a Hebrew name, and supported him as he's gone off to join the Israeli military. There were many more films produced during this period of Palestinian history. Some estimates go as high as about 50, but unfortunately, due to the invasion of Beirut in 1982, the Israeli military was able to capture the PLO's film archive, and all of what was in it was lost. However, some Israeli scholars have managed to find and confirm that some of the films hosted in this archive previously thought to have been lost remain in the classified section of the archives of the IDF to this day. Following the destruction of the Palestinian film archives, Palestinians continued making films, now financed either independently or by foreign institutions rather than solely by resistance groups. This new period, which continues until today, has shifted its focus to the individual experience of Palestinians living under occupation in the diaspora or in resistance movements. Documentaries have always been important in Palestinian cinema, and in this period it would continue to be an important way for filmmakers to get their message across. This period saw a continuation in this tradition, with newer artists utilizing many different approaches to documentaries about the Palestinian struggle. Mohammed Al-Attar's documentary, The Iron Wall, gives a good in-depth look at the legal systems that Israel has set up to allow settler violence in the West Bank, and a good overlook at the entire occupation for people who are just starting to learn about the topic. Likewise, Leila Khaled, Hijacker, directed by Leila Makboul, focuses on the life of Leila Khaled, a member of the PFLP who hijacked a plane in the late 60s. Focusing on her story highlights the reality that many members of Palestinian resistance groups find themselves in, and allows them to explain from their own point of view why they are engaged in armed struggle to free their country. Children of Shatila, directed by Mai Masri, follows the life of two siblings growing up in the Shatila refugee camp in Lebanon. Given a camera by the film's director, the two children film their own lives, the camp in which they live, and interview members of their family, all survivors of the Nakba and the 1982 invasion of Beirut. Similarly, Jenin Jenin, a 2003 documentary by Mohammed Bakri, follows the survivors of the 2002 Jenin refugee camp invasion. Edited together with no voiceover and filmed only a few hours after the massacre had ended, Bakri is able to talk to survivors of the camp, homeless fathers, doctors, children, and capture everyone's immediate reactions. Although much of the film is incredibly tragic, Bakri also manages to capture the spirit of resistance in Palestinian youth.
بخافش من ناس زيهم هذول الجبنة بخافش منهم زي الفيران يعني معاهم سلاح ومعاهم دبابات يبقوا يتزروكوا بين الدبابات خايفين منا إحنا يعني مدنيين بس هم إرادتهم ضعيفة خوفهم لدرجة الجنون.
Another documentary directed by Mohammed Bakri is 1948, a collection of interviews with Palestinian elders discussing the moment they fled from their villages during the Nakba. The documentary spends no time explaining what the Nakba is, so the film is best viewed by people who already have a basic understanding of what happened, but the experiences of the people that have been captured in this film is an invaluable document and should be considered essential viewing to those who want to better understand the Nakba.
الناس يعني صارت تشرد القرية هذه تروح هذيك تشرد قبلها.
قديش قتلوا في البلد؟
والله القتل إشي كثير يعني مش
قديش العدد يعني؟
يمكن إنه أقول لك الدوائم كان ضحيتها مش أقل من 400-500 بني آدم. ما بين ذكر وما بين أنثى وما بين صغير وكبير.
5 broken cameras, shot and co-directed by the Palestinian Ahmed Barnat, and co-directed by the Israeli Guy Davidi, follows a few years in Imad's life in Bil'in, a village in the West Bank. From shootings by settlers to evictions from the Israeli military, Barnat recorded the first few years of his son's life on a series of 5 cameras, each one eventually being destroyed by the Israeli military when Barnat recorded something they had wanted to hide. The film received a nomination for Best Documentary at the Oscars, and ironically, after Barnat and his family landed in LA to go to the ceremony, they were detained by the police who didn't believe his reason for visiting the US. Little Palestine, Diary of a Siege, directed by Abdallah Al-Khatib, documents life in the Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria during the Syrian civil war, a time period which resulted in more than 100 people at the camp starving to death. Despite these conditions, the film continues to highlight the spirits of the children, unafraid of the bombs dropping around them and the other adults of the camp gathered in loud protest.
أنا بحلم إنه يرجع المخيم مثل ما كان. أنا بحلم نفتح الطريق. أنا بحلم أفتح الطريق معلش. أنت حلمت قبل شوي كنت تحلم إنك عم تاكل زبدة. أنا بحلم إنه يرجع أخوي يعيش. عن جد بحلم إنه أخوي يرجع يعيش. قعدنا مشتاق له.
Bye Bye Tiberias is another incredibly personal documentary that has recently come out, following the return of Hiam Abbas, the mother of Lina Sualem, the film's director, to her village Derhana to interview all the people that Hiam grew up with. Hiam Abbas left Palestine for France in order to achieve her dream of becoming an actress, and she did. Abbas is an actress in many of the films on this list, but Western audiences might recognize her from her role on Succession. Ticket to Jerusalem is a 2002 hybrid feature and documentary film directed by Rashid Mashrawi because the plot is fictional, but the characters and filming took place in reality, with real IDF soldiers coming in while filming and stealing things belonging to the film's protagonist. Nevertheless, the film's protagonist continues on trying to make it to Jerusalem with his mobile cinema. I want to take this opportunity to shine a light on the condition under which many Palestinian films have been made. When interviewed about the process of making his movies, Rashid mentions that he wasn't allowed to collect the film equipment under Israeli law, so he had to get someone with an Israeli passport and put the entire production under his name. Then, he wasn't technically allowed to be on set, so his cameraman, a friend from Germany, had to act as if he was the director the entire time so as not to arouse suspicion from the IDF. Another film directed by Rashid Mashrawi is his 1996 film Haifa, following a man and his family living in a refugee camp. The man puts on an act as the town's goof to bring people some happiness, and along his daily trips to the camp, we meet a variety of different characters reflecting different aspects of Palestinian society. The mother waiting for her son to be released, the young men who are already jaded about the world they grew up in, and children who idolize their future. With the continuing rise of Palestinian film came the rise of Palestinian directors who made a name in their own right. One of the most respected of these would undoubtedly be Michael Khlefi, a Palestinian born in Nazareth and currently living in Belgium. His earliest work, which he completed in his early 30s, was a documentary called Malul Celebrates Its Destruction. Malul was a Palestinian village in Galilee that was destroyed during the Nakba, and every year on Israeli Independence Day, the survivors of the expulsion gathered to have a picnic in the place that was once their village. Khlefi joins them on this occasion to document the tradition and to allow survivors of the Nakba to reflect on their expulsion.
أنا قتلتين هل اللي قتلهن روح يقتلوا له أنا قتلتين أنا ما قتلتش بس.
Another of Khlefi's acclaimed works is his 1995 drama Tale of Three Jewels. The film follows a young boy who lives with his mom and sister in the Gaza Strip. His father is in prison and his brother is on the run, having joined a Palestinian armed resistance group. Despite the harsh reality of the boy's life, he imagines that he's living in a fantasy world to escape his reality, and soon falls in love with another girl at his school. The film can be funny at times and sad at others, and includes some of the best images in a Palestinian film that I've ever seen. However, Khlefi's most well-known film has got to be his 1987 work, Wedding in Galilee. Following the events leading up to the wedding of a Palestinian couple shortly after the Nakba, Wedding in Galilee attempts to create a cast of characters, each with their own perspectives on the recent expulsion. After the father of the groom decides his son will have a perfect wedding, he cuts a deal with the Israeli occupation forces to allow them to have a traditional Palestinian wedding, but only if the Israeli soldiers get to attend as well. What follows is 2 days of tension between not just the Israelis and the Palestinians, but within family members arguing about whether to continue with the wedding or to sabotage it, all of which culminates in a very unexpected ending. Another Palestinian filmmaker of note is Elia Suleiman, who received international attention for his 1996 film Chronicle of a Disappearance. Unlike some of the other movies on this list that create a single narrative throughout, Chronicle of a Disappearance follows a series of unconnected short scenes designed to reflect life under occupation in the West Bank. In Suleiman's depiction of Palestine, men return to their family after 15 years abroad, store owners try to sell bottles of holy water, a Palestinian filmmakers conference has microphone problems, and elders go to bed listening to Israeli TV. His next big film, 2002's Divine Intervention, is similarly structured and is a mostly silent film that follows a Palestinian living in Nazareth who constantly has to pass through Israeli checkpoints to reach Ramallah, the city where his dying father is hospitalized. The film actually caused quite a controversy in the US because even though the film was nominated for a Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, the Oscars in the US refused to accept a Best Foreign Feature nomination for Divine Intervention on the basis that Palestine did not constitute a country. Thanks to the controversy that arose from this though, the following year Palestine was allowed to nominate a film for Best Foreign Feature. The next work of Suleiman's I want to highlight is his most recent, 2019's It Must Be Heaven. In another half-documentary, half-narrative feature film, Elia Suleiman plays himself as he travels from Palestine to France and then the US, looking for funding for his latest feature. Along the way, the film highlights the differences in what audiences perceive Palestinians should be like and draws comparisons to the increasing militarization of countries like France and the US to Suleiman's own life in Palestine.
I'm Palestinian.
Palestinian? Goodness gracious, let me look at you. I've never seen a Palestinian. Palestinian inside of my cabinet, isn't that something? Oh, brother, goodness gracious. Well, guess what? This ride is on me. Yes, sir.
Another prominent Palestinian filmmaker is Anna-Marie Jassir, whose short film Like 20 Impossibles is a brutally realistic look at the lives of a Palestinian film crew. On their way to the West Bank from inside Israel to film a documentary after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the film crew is stopped at an Israeli checkpoint, which suddenly breaks out into violence. Her next film, Salt of the Sea, is another look at the effects of the occupation, following an American-born Palestinian who comes to Israel to collect her grandfather's old savings that he had left behind and to visit her old family's home. There, she comes face to face with a liberal Zionist, drinking coffee out of an End the Occupation mug, who tries to justify her owning the house now. The last film of Jassir I want to mention is the 2017 film Wajib. Wajib follows a Palestinian man living in Italy, returning and visiting family for the first time in years, and it just so happens to be the same time as his sister is getting married. The man and his father are stuck handing out the wedding invitations, and while reconnecting, old grievances come up about how he was raised and the choices the man made that led him to leave Palestine. The last director I'll specifically highlight is Hani Abu Assad, another filmmaker from Nazareth that has made a career for himself with drama films that often focus on the way Palestinians come into contact with the occupation. Take, for example, his 2005 film Paradise Now, which follows two longtime friends who have agreed to become suicide bombers. The film tracks their last few hours before the attacks, going into their backgrounds, why they decided to become suicide bombers, and how they're grappling with the end of their lives. The film has incredibly good reviews, and it's very interesting to see a movie focusing on the motivations behind suicide bombers, rather than the black and white depictions of terrorism that is prevalent in more Western films. Another one of Abu Assad's films that deals with the nuance of living under occupation is his 2013 film Omar, which follows the titular character Omar and two of his childhood best friends. The three young Palestinians attempt to live their life in Israel, working as bakers, hopping the West Bank border wall to visit loved ones, and training themselves so that they can fight back against the IDF. However, when Omar gets arrested, he's asked to be an informant for the Israeli military, which sets off a chain of events revealing how much influence Israel can have over the personal relationships between longtime friends. The most recent of Abu Assad's film, the 2020 Huda Salon, also deals with the IDF trying to recruit Palestinians to work for their secret service. When Reem, a woman in an unhappy marriage living in the West Bank, visits a hair salon, her hairstylist uses what she knows about her personal life to try to blackmail her into joining the Israeli Secret Service and giving out information about the people in her community. The film goes in depth on the circumstances in someone's life that the occupation forces can exploit to get them to become accomplices. For example, it's pretty well known that the IDF will blackmail gay Palestinians into becoming informants under threat of outing them to their family and community. But this movie goes in depth on how this same tactic is often used against women who were in unhappy marriages or who had cheated on their husbands. While it's important that Palestinian films don't shy away from any tragedies endured or the hardships of life in occupied Palestine, it's also important to highlight that even through everything that's happening, joy and community continues to exist. And so some filmmakers have taken that chance to make films that highlight the irony in their lives. An example of this is the 2003 short film Chic Point, Fashion for Israeli Checkpoints. Instead of confronting the inhumanity of the Israeli checkpoint head-on, the film's director Sharif Waked instead opts to explore this dehumanization through the lens of a fashion walk, filled with Palestinian men in outfits that reveal their stomachs and ribs. Similarly, the comedy documentary Jeremy Hardy vs. the Israeli Army follows British comedian Jeremy Hardy and the film's director Leila Sansour as they join activists in the international solidarity movement while visiting Bethlehem and seeing the destruction that the IDF has brought on local refugee camps and hospitals. But what starts off as Jeremy Hardy's lighthearted attempts to break awareness of the occupation evolves into the crew having to dodge real bullets and becoming witnesses to atrocities. The next film I want to mention is the 2009 film America, following a mother and son from the West Bank who move in with their family living in America shortly after the events of 9/11. While this film feels much more like a standard dramedy than the previous two films, it manages to be both funny and have serious moments in it, dealing with the expectations of immigrants in the United States. Having this Palestinian film set in the West itself, dealing with the experiences of the diaspora, gives it the opportunity to deal with immigrant-specific experiences, such as not being able to find a job despite having all the right qualifications, and racism in the workplace and school due to where you were born. One of my favorite parts of the movie were those focusing on the relationship between the Palestinian son in the West Bank and his cousins who were raised in the United States.
Your occupation?
Yes, it is occupied for 40 years.
No. What is your occupation? What do you do for a living, ma'am?
The last dramedy I want to focus on is a 2020 film named Gaza Mon Amour, directed by the brothers Arab and Tarzan Nasser. The film takes place in Gaza and follows two older Gazans and the ways their lives intertwine. Isa is a fisherman who finds a statue in the ocean and tries to pawn it for money, but ends up having to hide from the police. He is in love with Siham, a woman who owns a tailor shop at the market he sells his fish at. Throughout the film, the two will come into contact in some funny situations and reflect on their futures in Gaza. Just like the third period of Palestinian cinema, allies of the Palestinian cause have also continued to make films about and with Palestinians. We've already talked about Jeremy Hardy and his collaboration with Leila Sansour, but another less comedic collaboration is that of Edward Said and Charles Bruce. Edward Said is a Palestinian born in Jerusalem that has become a well-respected academic, writing Orientalism, his essential book about how Arabs and other people living in the East are perceived in the West, almost 50 years ago now. Teaming up with Charles Bruce, an employee at the BBC at the time, the two produced a 50-minute television special called In Search of Palestine, Edward Said's Return Home. Charles followed Said's return back to Palestine, recording his experiences of visiting his homeland once again, while Said gives context to the images seen, remembers back to his childhood, and reflects on the Oslo Accords, which were only recently signed when the short was filmed. Another film made by a non-Palestinian is the 2019 documentary Gaza Fights for Freedom by the American journalist Abby Martin. The film is an in-depth dissection of the development of the Gaza Strip and how life has come to be as harsh as it was in 2019. She also includes footage of and interviews with people who were participants in the March of Return, a massive peaceful protest where people walked up to the Gaza border wall only to be massacred by the IDF, with more than 200 people, many of them children, being killed indiscriminately by Israeli gunfire. Some people will think that the October 7th attacks was the only thing Gazans had done to fight for their freedom, but this film really shows that Gazans have been protesting for years in different ways, and all of them have resulted in the same thing. And then of course are the films of the fourth period of Palestinian cinema that can't be categorized, such as Mohammed Malas's 1992 film, The Night. Malas, who is a Syrian, made this film as a way of coming to terms with who his father was. The film jumps between time periods in Syrian history, always relating back to the lonely grave of his father in Syria's Golan Heights, another unnamed martyred Palestinian resistance fighter. From the French occupation of Syria to the 1948 expulsion of Palestinians from Israel to the 1967 invasion of Syria, the film highlights all the important moments in Malas's father's life that made an impact on him, that shaped him into the person he became. Other films have been made about close personal tragedies as well, such as Fida Kishta's 2012 film Where Should the Birds Fly? Following the perspectives of a woman and a little girl, the film documents the experiences of Palestinians living in Gaza, culminating in the 2008 Israeli attack. Interspersed with the lives of the two main characters are interviews with Gazans who share stories that could have easily been told again today.
نقول لهم ما تخافوش بنخفف عنهم يقول لهم ابويا تخافوش عدوا الجيش ما زال الجيش حطنا هنا قاعد بجيب الحليب للاطفال بجيب الاكل بجيب لكن مش عارفين انه بده يبعث لنا قذائف يقتلنا يعني انا عقب ما خبطوا القذائف هذه الكبيره قذائف الاباتشي ده خبطوا من 3 قذائف تقريبا او اكثر او اقل هاي البحث فاكره يعني انا كنت افكر انه انا في الانفاس الاخيره قاعد بموت وبقول اشهد ان لا اله الا الله بنطق الشهادتين ما لقيت حالي الا بقوم هيك كل بنزف دم هجمت على امي اشوفها عشان انقذها اطلع لقيتها امي قاعده بالشكل هذا هيك عامله الجزء هذا اليمين كله ما فيش رايح العينها بخدها بنص باذنها حتى يا ربي ما فيش بهز فيها يما ما بتردش مستشهد على الفور ابويا كذلك الامر من عند عينه من عند راسه برضه مستشهد على الفور بنتي حملتها بنتي الصغيره اللي هي وحيدتي عمرها 2.5 سنين حملتها على اساس برضه انقذها لقيتها جثه هامده بتتحركش رجعتها مطرحها بتطلع في اخواني اغلبهم مصاوبين بتطلع في اخي اللي برضه متصاوب بتطلع كلهم مصاوبين الكل فاتح تمه بينها اللي ركبته واقعه اللي اعضاء من جسمه واقعه رايحه اشلاء.
Similarly tragic is Mai Masri's 2015 film 3000 Nights, an in-depth look into life inside of an Israeli military jail. After refusing to give false testimony incriminating another Palestinian in front of a judge, Layal is sentenced to 8 years in prison, a sentence which becomes even more complicated when Layal finds out she is pregnant. Transferred to a mixed prison with both Israeli women and Palestinian political prisoners, the film highlights a community of prisoners that support each other through the most difficult of situations.
ما تحكي لها ماشي.
Speaking of community, the 2017 film Naila and the Uprising focuses on retelling the story of the women that were involved in the outbreak of the first Intifada, using a mixture of archival footage, interviews, and animation to recreate the story. What's striking about the film is the documentation of the numerous ways that Palestinians had tried to foster nonviolent resistance through boycotts, rallies, and underground clinics until the Israelis gave them no other choice. Then, of course, are the newer films focused on life under occupation. The 2020 film 200 Meters follows a father trying desperately to reach his son in a hospital just 200 meters away, separated by a border wall that seems impossible to cross. Similarly, the short film The Present follows a man and his daughter traveling past Israeli checkpoints to buy a new refrigerator, only to realize too late that returning to the West Bank with their new present will be more difficult than they had anticipated. And then, of course, are the films that focus not on the physical effects, but the psychological ones. In Farah Nabulsi's 2023 film, The Teacher, we follow a school teacher in the West Bank who suffers tragedy after tragedy. After the death of his son and divorcing of his wife, the Israeli army comes and destroys his house while searching for a hostage. Despite this, he remains committed to his job and to helping two of his students, and soon develops a romantic relationship with a British human rights worker. Similarly dealing with mental health, the 2022 film directed by Mahahaj, Mediterranean Fever, follows a Palestinian man with a seemingly happy life, a wife, 2 kids, and a nice home on the beach, though he suffers from depression. After months of not being able to do anything, he is seemingly spurred back to life by the arrival of a new neighbor, a thief that he begins to drive around and helps commit crimes as inspiration for a new novel. And yet, his new friendship opens the floodgate to a deep grief that is held by much more than a single individual. Although we are now more than 70 years after the Nakba, filmmakers still try their best to capture this tragic event and bring it to modern-day films. This was the case with the 2021 film directed by Dareen Salam, Farah. The film takes place in 1948 and follows a girl, brimming with excitement after finding out that her father will allow her to study in university. The very next morning, the Haganah, one of the Zionist militias responsible for ethnic cleansing that would eventually be formed into the IDF, would storm the village, and the girl becomes separated from her family. Stuck in a storage room, and only being able to witness the atrocities through a peephole, she has to sit and watch in silence, praying for her survival. I had the privilege of watching this film in Berlin with the film's director, who told the audience after the film had finished that the story was based on a little girl that her own grandma had known shortly after her own expulsion to Lebanon. And then, of course, are the movies that have come following the start of the genocide in Gaza, the most well-known of which has to be the 2024 documentary No Other Land. Following Basel Adra, a Palestinian growing up in the West Bank, and Yuval Abraham, an Israeli journalist who focuses on working in the West Bank, the two document the process of ethnic cleansing taking place in Basel's native town, Masaferiyata. The documentary shows the effect that ethnic cleansing has had on all of Palestinian society, but also continues to be extremely close and shows the effects of this life on Basel and his family, showcasing the closeness of a family that continues to resist despite always being under attack by the Israeli army, and culminating in a deep family tragedy taking place shortly before the 7th of October 2023. The last film I want to mention is actually one that hasn't been released yet. Obviously, since the genocide in Gaza has started, Palestinians in the diaspora have taken to all different forms of protests. In Berlin, Palestinians have produced and created a short film titled Uncle, Give Me a Cigarette, based on the short story of the same name. Written by Walid Dakka, a Palestinian novelist and PFLP member who spent almost 40 years as a political prisoner and was tragically martyred in April of this year, Uncle, Give Me a Cigarette follows the internal reflections of a man in an Israeli jail after a child in a cell nearby asks him for a cigarette. I don't want to explain the whole story, so you can find the original short story itself online, and check out the director's Instagram in the description of the video to stay tuned for any updates about a future release date. However, I'm sure he isn't the only Palestinian who has been working on films in the last year. If any of you know of any Palestinian films being made in your own communities, please leave them in the comments down below. I, and I'm sure everyone else watching, would really love to check them out. Lastly, I want to mention one last thing. The Berlinale Film Festival has repeatedly shown itself to be a staunch supporter of Israel and the far right, inviting members of the far-right Alternative for Germany party to the festival, and going as far as to label Basel Adra and Yuval Abraham as anti-Semites for their film No Other Land. This despite the judges, organizers, and funders mostly being white German Christians and Yuval being Jewish. In response, a group of filmmakers have created Palinale, an alternative film festival for those artists who wish to boycott the Berlinale this year. So I ask you to please follow the account in the description to show your support and let your filmmaker friends know to submit to the festival. If you're interested in any of the films I've talked about in this video, I've included a Google Doc in the description of the video that includes links so that you can track down and watch anything you're interested in. From the early years to the Epoch of Silence to the Revolutionary Period and today, we don't know yet what the fourth period will be called because it's still ongoing. However, the fifth period, I believe, will be created by the next generation of Palestinian filmmakers, those who can center the stories on their lives in a liberated Palestine, one that has begun to heal from the past 70 years of occupation. And when that time comes, the past 70 years of films and filmmakers, from Ibrahim Hassan Sirhan to Mustafa Abu Ali, Hani Jawariya, Mikir Khlefi, and Basel Adra, all of their work will become a priceless look into decades of both tragedies endured and resistance to oppression. I want to end with a quote from Rashid Masharawi when he was asked about the nature of Palestinian cinema. I think what makes Palestinian cinema exist is individual filmmakers. It's independent filmmakers who make auteur films. Their relationship to cinema keeps this project alive, the Palestinian cinema. Palestine is not a country, it's not even autonomous. Palestine is only a situation. In the same day, you can wake up in the morning in a state, in the day it's a war, by the evening it's an intifada, and the day after it's autonomous again. Palestine in the cinema has history. It is a beautiful country in the Mediterranean. It has Jaffa, it has Haifa. Cinema is also a memory. Palestine in the cinema is not only a political situation, it's a people with culture, language, art, with negative and positive sides. We exist in cinema as a nation like any other nation. The filmmakers have managed to put this idea into the world while politicians fail to, or haven't done so until now. Even if we make non-political cinema, it will have a major political result, because what do we want? We only want to be like others. In the cinema, that can happen. I wanted to include this as a little bonus section separate from the content of the original video, because I wanted only films that were either made by Palestinians or focused on Palestine itself to be included in the core of the video, and these films to be an appendix of sorts to that. Obviously, there should be nothing more important to the Palestinian liberation movement than the voices of Palestinians themselves. However, I found a few films made by Israelis that I wanted to include in this appendix. I want to be clear that these are movies that have a Zionist outlook, movies that fundamentally believe that Israel has a right to exist, but still critique it in some way. I wouldn't have included these movies at all, but upon thinking, I figured some of the things they document could actually be used to dispel the most basic Zionist myths about Israel. Take, for example, the 2022 film directed by Guy Davidi, Innocence, which follows children who grow up in Israel, constantly being exposed to IDF propaganda, taught to shoot guns from a young age, told to draw explosions and tanks, and to dehumanize Palestinians. Zionists love to claim that Israel is the safest place in the world for Jews, but that's kind of hard to argue when it is the Israeli state itself training children to be soldiers from birth. A lot of the kids that this documentary is about expresses resistance to the ideas of joining the military, and then end up joining it anyway, only for them to die just a short while later. Another one of these films is Tantura, a documentary by Alon Shvatz that follows the cover-up of the atrocities committed during the Nakba in Israeli society. Alon talks to inhabitants of the town who were the original settlers that displaced the Palestinians who had already lived there, scholars and politicians who deny any atrocities happened, and veterans of the militias that committed the atrocities, many of them who boast and laugh about what they did, still to this day. The final film I want to mention is King Bibi, a short documentary that analyzes Netanyahu's political career in Israel. The film pulls archival footage all the way back to the 80s, and it is kind of shocking to see that Netanyahu has always been the way he is now. He didn't have a period of extreme radicalization, he's always been who he is, and people in Israel have consistently been supporting him. That's all I want to mention in this brief appendix, so I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you get to check out a lot of these films that I have linked down below. Thank you for watching.